Hello, dear listener. Before we begin, welcome old friends and new wanderers alike into this tranquil corner of history. Tonight we drift into a world where the simple act of examining your teeth could feel like peering into society's soul. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you cherish gentle tales of forgotten times. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a gaslit parlor, golden light dancing across patterned wallpaper as you cradle a warming cup of tea. The air carries a hint of smoky coal from a hearth just beyond view, and the plush velvet cushions beneath you hold the faint scent of lavender sachets. You might think you're safe from toothaches in such a charming room, yet tonight you'll discover that behind every polite smile hides a twinge ready to awaken. You step gingerly onto a velvet chaise, imagining early Victorians gathering around crackling fireplaces, sharing gossip, and sometimes silent cries of unexpected pain. In mid-19th century London, many families believed a gleaming set of teeth signified robust well-being and moral fortitude, a mainstream historical fact that found its way into etiquette manuals praising bright smiles at polite gatherings. You can almost feel the hush as parlor maids hold smelling salts nearby, anticipating that sudden, sharp exclamation when someone's jaw clenches in agony. As you settle deeper into this hush, you notice portraits on the walls, somber ladies in high-necked gowns and bespectacled gentlemen, each bearing a flawless set of teeth. Owning such pearly whites meant you had the means to afford a surgeon's fees and the discipline to maintain daily care, often using frayed cloth dipped in homemade pastes of burnt bread, crushed herbs, and mint. Yet, beyond social cachet, these teeth served a practical purpose. Cavities, if left unchecked, could lead to infections so severe that simple gum inflammation might turn life-threatening without modern antibiotics. The sharp scent of pennyroyal oil wafts from a small glass vial perched on the mantel, a fringe belief held by some that this herbal extract could ward off tooth rot by purifying the mouth of invisible spirits. Nearby, a tiny lodestone hangs from a ribbon, its owner convinced its magnetic pull would draw out unseen humors, blamed for aches and chills. You might smirk at these curious notions, but they illuminate how early dentists and households balanced emerging science with lingering folklore. Historians still debate exactly when mechanical innovations began to eclipse these more mystical remedies. A low hum drifts from the narrow street below, where horse-drawn carriages trundle over rain-slicked cobblestones, echoing the distant rhythm of dental tweaks in back rooms and parlors. You imagine a young surgeon arriving by coach, his leather satchel heavy with polished metal tools, sharp forceps, rudimentary probes, and small mirrors designed to slip into a patient's mouth for careful inspection. By 1858, the British Dental Association had formed formally, marking a significant milestone as practitioners began distinguishing themselves from barber surgeons who once bled patients and yanked teeth indiscriminately. Within this parlor, you become keenly aware of how the golden glow of oil lamps bathes polished mahogany floors, and the faint tang of early antiseptic, carbolic acid, lingers in corners. Surgeons began experimenting with carbolic sprays after Joseph Lister introduced them in the late 1860s. Though many households concocted DIY rinses from vinegar, wine, and crushed thyme long before official endorsements existed. You run your hand along the chaise's fringe, imagining a patient reclining beneath a brass lamp's halo, heart hammering as a surgeon prepares for the inevitable probe and pull. You sense the Victorian ethos. Display your teeth as proof of decorum, yet brace yourself against inevitable decay. Even children as young as 6 were taught rudimentary brushing using twigs chewed into frayed bristles or cloth wrapped around ivory handles. Local apothecaries sold small bottles of tooth powders made from chalk, sulfur, and mint, and women kept ivory-handled brushes beside porcelain basins filled with scented water. Still, folklore flourished. Some believed that burying a lost baby tooth under a full moon would summon a fairy to leave a silver coin in exchange, while others warned that sudden tooth loss foretold the demise of a distant relative. The parlor door hinges squeak as you imagine a dentist in his crisp frock coat stepping across the threshold, boots dusted with London grit. He carries a mahogany case inlaid with mother of pearl, its interior brimming with forceps and elevators that catch the lamp's glow. His pride in craft shows in every detail, from polished brass instruments to finely stitched leather gloves. That meticulous attention speaks to an era when teeth straddled the frontier of medicine, technology, and social symbolism. A hush returns as you note how each household balances practical need with fashionable display. On marble mantels, families place small porcelain jars of minty paste, convinced that scent alone will convince guests of their refinement. Meanwhile, newspapers carry adverts promising miracle powders to whiten teeth overnight, and small pamphlets offer advice to rub charcoal and vinegar for a dazzling smile. Yet, when pangs strike, the truly desperate seek traveling tooth wizard shows. Their booths feature curtained stages where a practitioner dramatically extracts a tooth as crowds gasp. Proof of skill and spectacle rolled into one. You close your eyes for a moment, allowing the soft light to flicker behind your lids as the distant clip-clop of hooves fades. Behind polished manners and lace-trimmed gowns, the quest for healthy teeth weaves together daily life, budding medical innovation, and whimsical fantasy. You inhale deeply, savoring this tapestry of fact and fringe, where every gentle glow and whispered conversation hints at a world both orderly and enchanting. In that hush, you drift deeper into the Victorian serenity, where teeth and tools whisper secrets still waiting to unfold. You find yourself ambling down a cobbled lane now, past neat brick townhouses under the faded gray of a Victorian sky. Fog curls up from the Thames like a curious cat, peeking into the windows of establishments both modest and grand. On your left, there's a wooden placard swinging gently in the breeze, etched in gold paint. Dental surgeon. Extractions performed. Gold fillings guaranteed. You pause, imagining the sign's original luster, freshly polished, meant to instill both confidence and curiosity in passers-by. Inside, the air is warm, heavy with the smells of cloves, chalk, and freshly oiled leather. You brush your fingertips over a cracked pamphlet left on the counter. On the separation of the barber from the toothmaster, it proclaims. For centuries before this moment, barbers had yanked molars with the same nonchalance they used to trim whiskers. But now, a new figure steps forward with polish and precision. The dental surgeon. It's a title that carries dignity, even if the tools still resemble medieval instruments of persuasion. You sit back in a stiff chair and observe as a patient before you, dressed in a waistcoat, knees rigid, lowers himself into the adjustable seat. A new invention claimed to provide better leverage. Across from him, the surgeon dons a freshly laundered apron, the hem just brushing his polished boots. The line between tradesman and physician is blurring, and you feel it. The 1840s marked the beginning of serious attempts to formalize dental training. You hear whispers that across the Atlantic, in Baltimore, a new dental college had been founded. In England, respectable surgeons began distancing themselves from their barbershop roots, offering not only extractions but also fillings, prosthetics, and hygiene advice. In your hands, a dog-eared issue of The Lancet outlines a spirited debate over licensing. Should a man handling molars be held to the same standards as one fixing femurs? And yet, not all of Victorian society buys into this professional evolution. In alleyway booths and traveling circuses, tooth pullers still draw crowds, tossing extracted molars into tin buckets with a flourish that earns them applause. You picture the showman now. Bright waistcoats, flashy grins, hands surprisingly steady. For a penny or two, they offer relief and performance, often with no sterilization, but an abundance of charm. Still, behind closed doors, the respectable dental surgeon works in increasing quietude. You listen as he explains to the patient in an even tone that the molar must go. He pulls open a drawer filled with gleaming metal and selects an instrument with the delicacy of a watchmaker. It's one of many hand-forged forceps now tailored to specific tooth shapes. Upper right canine, lower left molar, each a reflection of dentistry's gradual sophistication. You think about how previously a one-size-fits-all approach led to broken jaws and far more blood than necessary. There's a slow reverence in how the tool is positioned, a small prayer in the gentle way it hugs the tooth before that one precise tug. You can feel the slight twinge in your own gums, not from pain, but anticipation. The room is hushed. And then, crack, just a soft pop, not a scream. The patient exhales. A faint trickle of blood is wiped away with a lavender-scented cloth. You're struck by how civilized it all seems, until you notice the jar in the corner. Glass, murky, half filled with discarded teeth. Some whole, others shattered. Each tooth was once someone's agony, now swimming together in faintly antiseptic water like lost pearls. On the mantel sits a small book, a gentleman's guide to maintaining his smile. Leafing through it, you see neat diagrams of toothbrushes, charts for identifying cavities, and a peculiar footnote on jaw alignment theories. The Victorians weren't just trying to fix mouths. They were developing a system to understand them. Your gaze lingers on an old portrait near the desk, likely the surgeon's predecessor. The man stares sternly, lips shut tight, as if to conceal the state of his own teeth. Dentistry had yet to earn full medical respect. While physicians might claim to save lives, dental surgeons wrestled quietly with their niche, often unrecognized, even among their peers. Some doctors dismissed oral health as secondary, a belief you still see echoing faintly in the sharp contrast of career prestige today. Still, the tide is turning. In 1859, the first British dental journal appeared, offering long, meandering editorials and curious case studies involving gold fillings and jaw infections. These publications circulated among elite practitioners like forbidden novels, carried in waistcoat pockets, read under flickering lamps, and smuggled into hospital lounges. At the same time, you notice how your surroundings reveal their dual purpose. A pristine basin next to a marble shelf, but just above it, a faded curtain hiding a more crude chair for less fortunate patients. Many surgeons offered a tiered system, fine treatment for the wealthy, brisk and painful for the poor. You can hear the polite conversation on one side and the muffled whimpering on the other. This was Victorian life. Progress stitched into inequality, buttoned up in politeness. A dog barks outside. The bell above the shop door rings faintly as another visitor enters. He hesitates, looking at the tools, then back at the surgeon. You wonder if it's his first time. Probably. He winces, just eyeing the array of metallic instruments. The surgeon smiles. Not broadly, never broadly, but just enough. A smile that says, "I've done this before, and you'll live to chew again." You watch as the man is led gently to the chair. The curtain is pulled. Another moment begins, and so the dental surgeon evolves, half physician, half mechanic, working beneath chandeliers and oil lamps, somewhere between modern science and dark art. You let the image fade a bit, fog curling back in, your chair shifting slightly, your breath slower. This new chapter in dentistry has barely begun, but its shape is familiar. You've seen the signs, heard the quiet transformation. And it all started when one man refused to pull teeth beside a lathered beard again. You turn a brass handle and enter a room humming with a curious mechanical rhythm, a patient whirring, like a lazy wasp trapped behind glass. This is the sound of the Victorian dental drill, a contraption that looks more like a miniature sewing machine than a medical device. You lean forward, intrigued, as the dentist carefully guides a hand-cranked drill, its flywheel spinning slowly with each deliberate twist of his wrist. It's mesmerizing and a little unsettling how something so precise can sound so ominous. The drill, a slow, whining melody of dread. You can almost feel it in your molars. Here you are, surrounded by finely lacquered walnut cabinets, every drawer filled with padded boxes of instruments, and among them the pride of any proper dental office in 1870, the drill. Long before electricity arrived with its buzzing motors and high-pitched whines, these early drills relied on sheer muscle, a foot pedal, a crank handle, a winding key. Some even used a spring mechanism that would snap forward in short bursts. All of them delivered what they promised: access, not necessarily comfort. You settle into the thought. Imagine sitting, your mouth propped open with a wooden wedge as the crank begins. Not fast, never fast, just steady and unavoidable. The tip of the drill is thin and sharp, but as it turns, grinding away at your enamel, it sends vibrations through your skull, deep and deliberate. There's no shriek of pain, just that cold, humming twinge. The one that dances along your nerves and asks very politely if you're still awake. The dentist pauses to dip the drill bit into a cooling solution, rose water or carbolic acid, depending on his mood, and you catch the faint aroma of iron and mint. The tools themselves gleam with a craftsmanship that borders on reverence. Some are engraved with floral patterns, others inlaid with mother of pearl. Why? Because if you're going to have your teeth carved into, you might as well be distracted by something pretty. The drill, called a burring engine in polite circles, came into broader use in the 1860s. Among the early pioneers was a man named George Fellows Harrington, who introduced a clockwork-style drill powered by springs and gears. You can almost picture him demonstrating it in a well-attended lecture, beaming as the mechanism clicked forward, offering both precision and spectacle. Historians note that while his invention was never widely adopted, it symbolized the growing belief that dentistry could be both scientific and sophisticated. But not everyone had access to these shiny contraptions. In rural areas or working-class clinics, simpler tools prevailed. Tiny bow drills, the kind once used in carpentry, were repurposed for dental use. Picture it. The dentist turning a string-bound bow back and forth like starting a fire, the bit slowly biting its way into an aching molar. You imagine the patient gripping the arms of the chair, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on the ceiling's water-stained plaster. And in the most makeshift of settings, the drill was replaced altogether with an awl, or a thin metal pick slowly twisted by hand. That, you think, must have been the purest form of dread. No spinning, no hum, just the awful patient pressure of someone burrowing into your tooth like a miner in search of pain. Of course, they didn't always get it right. Sometimes the drill slipped, sometimes it struck a nerve, sometimes it just took too long. You find yourself wincing at the thought of a cavity excavation lasting 20 minutes, the tension building with each turn of the crank, your jaw locked in silent protest. And still, you had to hold still, because any movement might send the bit skittering off course, or worse, straight through. By the 1870s, the dental elite began importing drills from America. One early electric model was debuted by a dentist named George F. Green, and though it still sounded like a swarm of angry insects, it dramatically reduced the time required to clear decay. But it wasn't adopted overnight. Many dentists were wary of relying on electricity, and patients even more so. There were tales of wires sparking mid-procedure, of tiny electric shocks delivered straight into the jaw. And while the historical record doesn't confirm all of these stories, the fear was very real. To soothe their patients, dentists sometimes offered distractions: a lavender-scented handkerchief to grip, a leather ball to squeeze, or even a stereoscopic viewer with gently shifting pastoral scenes. You hold the frame in your hands now, watching a Victorian meadow blur slowly from left to right as a cow grazes peacefully, while in the next room, someone's molar is being cranked into history. And here's a fringe detail for you, one rarely mentioned in textbooks. Some wealthier patients brought in their own drill handles, carved from ivory or bone, passed down from generation to generation like cursed family heirlooms. The idea that if your grandfather survived with this drill, so would you. Dentists didn't object if it helped the patient sit still and keep from biting their fingers. Well, sentimentality could be therapeutic. Your thoughts wander for a moment as the cranking slows. You picture a quiet waiting room beyond the door. Floral wallpaper, ticking clocks, and trembling knees. Maybe a child sits beside his mother, eyeing the drill box with wide, accusing eyes. He knows what's inside. He knows what's coming. But oddly, you're calm, because here in this gentle retelling, the whirring fades into a lullaby. The drill becomes rhythm, the hum a heartbeat. And each twist of the crank, though jarring, marks the onward march of progress. They weren't cruel, these Victorian dentists. They simply didn't have what we have now. They relied on ingenuity, patience, and a tolerance for discomfort that seems almost alien to modern ears. The drill is returned to its velvet-lined drawer. The patient breathes through his nose, exhausted but relieved. You can almost taste the chalky rinse he's offered, swishing it around his tongue before spitting into a delicate porcelain bowl. And you, reclining just a bit deeper into your own cushions, feel that same peculiar gratitude for drills that whirred before they buzzed, for tools that were clumsy but crafted, and for the small mercy of knowing that your next dental appointment won't involve a crank handle. Not unless you're into that sort of thing. You're back in that quiet parlor now, where oil lamps throw long shadows across button-tufted upholstery and polished floors. The air carries a trace of menthol and coal smoke. But your attention drifts upward to the gleam of a peculiar object mounted in a wooden case, a gleaming set of porcelain teeth. Not just any teeth, mind you, but a full set of upper and lower dentures, smiling eternally with the kind of confidence only falsehood can muster. It's time to talk about Victorian prosthetics, the great silent performers of the dental world. You sidle closer, peering into the set's uncanny grin. The teeth are unnervingly white, maybe too white, held in place by pink gum ridges shaped from hardened rubber. If they had a voice, you imagine it'd be chipper and just a little smug. You wouldn't be far off. In an age when social class was communicated through posture, accent, and pocket watch chains, your smile, true or manufactured, was just as revealing. The dentures before you are examples of vulcanite work, a revolutionary material patented in the 1850s. Charles Goodyear, yes, the tire fellow, discovered that by mixing rubber with sulfur and heating it under pressure, you got something flexible but firm, a kind of industrial miracle. Soon after, dentists began crafting gum plates from this resilient pinkish material, embedding porcelain or ivory teeth into the base. The result? Durable, affordable dentures with a shockingly lifelike appearance. But this wasn't always the case. Before vulcanite, dentures were a delicate, unpredictable art. Some were carved painstakingly from hippopotamus ivory. Others assembled from actual human teeth, salvaged from battlefields, graveyards, or the mouths of the desperate. The so-called Waterloo teeth were macabre trophies, taken from fallen soldiers after the 1815 battle. Their youth, ironically, made them ideal candidates for a second life in someone else's smile. You think of the strange intimacy there. Some anonymous private's incisors sitting prettily in a duchess's mouth, chatting politely over tea. It's said that early denture wearers had to carry handkerchiefs, not just for decorum, but to discreetly readjust their unruly false teeth. The fit was loose, the adhesives primitive. In some circles, removing your dentures before a particularly hearty laugh was considered not impolite, but practical. Yet, with vulcanite came stability and controversy. The American Vulcanite Company held strict patents, and Victorian dentists had to pay fees simply to use the material. Some refused. Others dodged the licenses and risked lawsuits. Historians still debate whether the legal drama surrounding vulcanite slowed dental progress or simply spurred innovation through spite. One might argue both. You picture a dentist in a quiet London neighborhood, pressing a freshly molded vulcanite plate into a plaster cast. The room smells like sulfur and chalk, and he works with the careful attention of a jeweler. He files, polishes, and inspects the alignment. Nearby, a drawer labeled "Canines Left Upper" rattles faintly when opened, revealing tiny porcelain shapes nestled in velvet. Not all patients were content with standard sets. Some demanded flair. There are whispered accounts of dentures with tiny gold inlays, or even embedded initials, subtle enough to go unnoticed by dinner guests, but flamboyant to those in the know. A wealthy banker, perhaps, flashing a modest R every time he bit into a fig tart. And here's something strange. Certain Victorians believed that false teeth could influence personality. It wasn't medical. It was aesthetic, almost mystical. A narrow smile might signal suspicion. A wide, toothy grin could mean affability or madness. One gentleman requested his dentures be crafted to convey measured geniality. You ponder what that even looks like. A smile just shy of a threat? There was also the matter of adhesives. Early options included wax, tree resin, and mixtures best left unnamed. One dentist's notes mention a patient who swore by mashed bananas as denture glue. Spoiler, it didn't hold. By the 1880s, commercial denture fixatives hit the market, boasting vague, hopeful names like Grip Powder and Smile Sure. If they worked just long enough for supper and one gentle waltz. But dentures weren't only for the elderly. Even young adults, faced with poor hygiene and sugar-heavy diets, often found themselves prematurely toothless. A good set of falsies meant access to courtship, to jobs, to dinner parties where the menu included something chewier than porridge. In fact, some brides reportedly received dentures as wedding gifts, because nothing said forever like a set of teeth that might outlive you both. You glance again at that porcelain grin and marvel at how ordinary it became. By the end of the century, dentures weren't just for hiding decay. They were a sign of upward mobility. If your teeth couldn't be saved, they could be replaced. Perfectly. Artificially. Permanently. And yet, there's an odd elegance to them, even a tenderness. A denture was a handmade object often crafted over weeks, requiring intimate measurements and multiple fittings. The dentist had to map the terrain of your mouth with softened wax, then recreate it in plaster, then press the rubber plate just so. A good fit meant no ulcers, no clicking, no unexpected slips during emotional speeches. Not every set was perfect, of course. Some patients became amateur sculptors themselves, filing edges in their parlors or adding layers of beeswax to tighten the fit. You picture them now, squinting at their own smiles in silver-backed mirrors, tongue clicking against false molars, not out of vanity, but pragmatism. And yes, even in the world of prosthetics, there were fads. The late 1800s saw a brief vogue for anatomically expressive dentures, where tooth shape reflected supposed character traits. Pointed cuspids for the daring, flat molars for the contemplative. It was a science no more accurate than palmistry, but people believed. Or, at least, they paid. There's one final object tucked in a glass case, a velvet-lined coffin for a single, gilded incisor. It was commissioned by a widow, engraved with her husband's initials, and never worn. Whether it was too beautiful or too sacred, no one knows. But there it sits, a reminder that even something as humble as a tooth can carry deep affection. You sit back now, lulled by the tick of a distant clock and the soft clink of porcelain. In this world of molded rubber and glazed ceramic, smiles were constructed with care, kissed by industry, and worn with cautious pride. The teeth may not have been real, but the hope behind them certainly was. You settle again in the red velvet chair, imaginary, yes, but plush and persistent, as the next strange item comes into view. A tray of gleaming tools lined like surgical soldiers. They're narrow, elongated, and very pointy. You don't need a medical degree to know they mean trouble. You pick one up and it's heavier than you expect. The handle is brass, warm from lamplight, and the tip, a sharp curve like the talon of a very tidy hawk. Welcome to the delicate dance of extraction. There's something romantic in a slightly dreadful way about how Victorians removed teeth, not with haste or brutality, as one might fear, but with methodical, almost courtly precision. Dentists didn't just yank, they extracted. And oh, what a verb that was. At the center of this symphony of suffering stood the dental key, an instrument that historians still debate with equal parts horror and awe. Resembling a door key from an old Gothic novel, the device featured a curved claw at one end and a wooden handle at the other. The idea was simple. You'd insert the claw between tooth and gum, twist the key like you're opening a cellar, and the tooth would, ideally, come out whole. Ideally. Of course, things didn't always go so smoothly. The dental key had a talent for snapping molars or fracturing the jaw if angled incorrectly. But for decades, it remained the extraction tool of choice, largely because it worked quickly and, by Victorian standards, elegantly. The patient would grit their teeth, at least the ones they had left, and the dentist, with a practiced twist, would deliver them from pain and into a gauzy cotton wad. Historians still argue whether the dental key's continued use was due to its effectiveness or dentists' sheer stubbornness. Even when better tools emerged, like forceps shaped to match different teeth, many practitioners clung to their keys like trusted, if slightly bloodthirsty, friends. And here's a curious tidbit for your dreams tonight. Not all Victorian extractions happened in clinics. Traveling dentists roamed the countryside, offering quick pulls at markets and fairs. Picture it. A man in a tidy frock coat with a folding chair, a velvet satchel of tools, and a sign that read, "Painless." He'd offer a coin for your old molar, yank it before you could change your mind, and hand you a peppermint as consolation. You imagine him under a striped canvas awning, the crowd gathering close. A woman clutches a handkerchief. A butcher takes a swig of something strong. And you, sitting wide-eyed with your mouth open, feel a gentle pressure, a twist, and then nothing at all. Except maybe the smell of cloves and a faint dizziness. Back in more refined settings, extraction came with its own rituals. Wealthier patients might be offered ether, or later, chloroform. These early anesthetics, though unpredictable, were miracles of their time. Administered with a soaked rag or glass inhaler, they could render a patient blissfully unaware, or dangerously unconscious. The dosage was guesswork. Some patients simply slipped into dreams. Others never woke up. And then there was nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, which entered dental fashion in the 1860s. Picture a room filled with the faint hiss of a pressurized canister. A wide-eyed patient breathing into a rubber mask. They might giggle, they might weep, or they might suddenly demand to buy a chicken. All of these were considered perfectly acceptable side effects. After all, if you were going to lose a tooth, why not do it with a laugh? In one preserved case file from 1873, a dentist records a patient who, under the influence of nitrous oxide, attempted to sing the national anthem mid-extraction. He only made it to the second line before fainting. You smile at the absurdity and the bravery. But not all patients trusted gas or ether. Many preferred to face the experience, clear-eyed and clenched-jawed. For them, the ritual of extraction was almost spiritual. The dentist would explain the process in hushed tones, sterilize the forceps in alcohol, and wrap the patient in a thick towel, partly to restrain movement, partly to catch the blood. One squeeze, one pull, and one tightly folded napkin later, the ritual was complete. You can almost hear the clink of the tooth landing in a china tray. A soft moan, then relief. There were different forceps for every occasion. Molar forceps with a wide bite, incisor forceps for those straight, stubborn front teeth, and root forceps shaped like delicate bird beaks for fishing out the broken ends of a tooth that didn't quite cooperate. The instruments were labeled not by tooth name, but by number, an intimate code known only to professionals. You imagine a dentist flicking through his lined drawer like a maestro selecting the right note. And speaking of maestros, did you know that some Victorian dentists considered themselves artists of agony? One famed London practitioner described his work as orchestral extraction, claiming he could pull 4 teeth in under a minute with a rhythm most divine. His patients may not have agreed, but they did keep coming back, assuming they had any teeth left to offer. By the 1880s, the dental key had largely fallen out of fashion. Newer tools with gentler curves and locking grips replaced the brutal twist. Training also improved. Where once anyone with a steady hand and strong stomach could advertise as a dentist, now there were schools, certifications, and techniques refined through textbooks rather than trial and error. Yet, even as technique progressed, extraction remained a psychological ballet. Dentists spoke in soft voices. They wore waistcoats and pocket watches, symbols of trustworthiness. Some even played music, usually piano or violin, to distract the patient or mask any unfortunate crunching. And for children, there were stories. "You're giving your tooth to the fairies," one dentist might say, slipping it into a tissue-lined envelope. "They'll bring you something in return." And just like that, the terror became transaction. A molar for a coin, a bicuspid for a dream. You find yourself oddly comforted now. The tools gleam less ominously. The tray doesn't seem quite so cold, because behind each extraction, each tiny deliberate tug, was the promise of relief. Not perfection, not yet, but less pain, a better night's sleep, the quiet freedom of no longer wincing at every bite of bread. And that's the thing about Victorian dentistry. It hurt, yes, but it tried. It always tried. You're drifting now, gently, as the gas lamp flickers beside your imaginary chair, casting its sleepy glow across shelves of curious bottles. The air smells faintly of cloves, carbolic, and something medicinal that whispers promises of numbness. You're in the Victorian dentist's apothecary corner, where solutions were brewed, stirred, and sniffed cautiously. Tonight, you're exploring the intoxicating world of early dental pain relief. Before Novocaine, before the tidy syringe click and the polite, "you might feel a pinch," there was a cabinet. In it, tiny bottles labeled with neat handwriting, inkwell black or dusty rose. Some smell of peppermint, some of spirits. All promise escape from that radiating jaw pain that keeps even the proudest stiff upper lip trembling at bedtime. Let's begin with clove oil, the timeless standby. Derived from the dried flower buds of the clove tree, this strong-smelling essence was the Victorians' go-to for numbing toothaches. You dab a little on your finger, just hypothetically, and immediately your gums tingle with fiery warmth. It's not subtle, but neither was the pain. Clove oil didn't fix anything, but it dulled the ache long enough for a night's rest, or a polite dinner conversation, which sometimes was all you needed. Then there was laudanum, the Victorians' beloved cure-all, equal parts tincture and temptation. Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and powdered opium. Just a few drops on a sugar cube or dabbed directly on the aching gum could bring about the floaty indifference of a well-laced dream. Of course, it was addictive. Small detail. But when your molars screamed like a banshee and there were no dentists for miles, you didn't question the dosage. You just slept. In fact, laudanum's appeal stretched far beyond the dentist's chair. Poets used it to chase visions, mothers to soothe colicky infants, and gentlemen to calm nerves before public speaking. One physician claimed it could dispel the agony of the soul through the molar root, which is either a metaphor or an overdose. You glance again at the shelf. There's a bottle labeled Spirit of Camphor, another creosote. These weren't perfumes. They were painkillers in their way. Camphor was derived from the wood of the camphor tree and had a pungent, nose-stinging scent. A dab on the gum could ease inflammation. Creosote, though, that one's a bit more dubious. Made from distilled wood tar, it was used to disinfect root canals and deaden nerves. Victorian dentists used it with great enthusiasm. Later generations would discover its toxicity. Oops! Still, for all their flaws, these concoctions were rooted in experimentation and sincere care. This was the era of the gentleman chemist, the self-trained, slightly mad genius who mixed elixirs by candlelight, seeking the perfect balance between numbness and consciousness. You picture him now, sleeves rolled, mustache twitching, muttering about viscosity and that peculiar bite at the tongue. Not all pain relief was chemical. Some was culinary. A hot poultice of mashed turnips or roasted onions, pressed to the cheek, was a common household remedy. Grandmothers swore by it. And saltwater rinses, as timeless as they are unglamorous, were as popular then as now. If you had a toothache in a kettle, you had hope. There's also the charming absurdity of the potato charm. Some Victorians believed that carrying a raw potato in your pocket could draw out dental pain, provided you didn't tell anyone you were doing it. The logic? Something about the root absorbing negative energy. Or maybe it was just an excuse to explain the suspicious lump in your waistcoat. And of course, no Victorian medical cabinet would be complete without ether. Introduced in the mid-1800s, ether was among the first substances to knock a patient unconscious entirely, allowing dentists to work quickly and quietly, while the patient dreamed of foggy nothingness. Administered by soaking a cloth and gently pressing it to the face, it was unpredictable, powerful, and deeply flammable. Entire offices had strict no-candle policies during extractions. Safety first. One fringe remedy that makes you pause is bezoar tincture. Bezoars, strange stone-like masses found in the stomachs of animals, were ground and soaked in alcohol to create a drink said to relieve all pain, including dental. The logic, such as it was, involved natural absorption of toxins. Historians now classify this under highly suspect. But back then, you took what you could get. Pain relief, after all, wasn't just about chemistry. It was psychology. Dentists learned to speak slowly, to move deliberately, to keep instruments out of view until the last possible moment. The soothing patter of a doctor's voice could reduce the sensation of pain better than many substances, and so could distraction. Some dentists employed music boxes, illustrated newspapers, or even jokes whispered over a cusp of molar dread. You smile at the thought of a drowsy patient giggling mid-sedation, perhaps confused by the gas or the rhythm of the phonograph. In those moments, pain became absurd, laughable, even theatrical. By the 1890s, sedation had grown more refined. Syringes allowed for local injections of cocaine, a then legal anesthetic that numbed precisely where needed. And yes, it was wildly effective. So much so that some patients became suspicious of its eerie silence. "I didn't feel a thing," one woman wrote in her diary, which means something must be terribly wrong. Yet many still preferred the old ways. The taste of clove oil, the smell of ether, the slow lull of laudanum as it crept into the bloodstream like a lullaby. There's something comforting, even now, about these flawed but earnest attempts to help. Historians still argue about the efficacy of these remedies. Was it the chemical action that worked, or simply the belief, the ritual? The sense of being cared for in a quiet room where someone with calm hands and a waistcoat murmured that everything would be all right soon. You lean back in the chair, warmed by the glow of that dusty apothecary, the clink of a bottle, the scratch of a quill. Somewhere nearby, a pot of water simmers, and a spoon stirs something soothing into a cup. Not a cure, perhaps, but a kindness. And sometimes that's enough. The room shifts slightly now, and the shelves and surgical trays recede into the soft mist of your half-dream. What lingers in the haze, however, are sounds, faint clatters, whispers, the ghostly scrape of metal on porcelain. And from this fog steps a figure in a crisp apron, spectacles catching the lamplight, hands fussing over a rather peculiar object. The earliest attempts at dentures. Yes, now we arrive at the age-old Victorian quest for a full and dazzling smile through entirely artificial means. You might think the Victorians simply popped in a neat little row of fake teeth like we do today. Oh no, dear listener, that would be too simple, too sterile, too modern. For them, dentures were an endeavor, an event. And as you'll soon learn, they weren't made from plastic. They were made from everything else. The most luxurious false teeth of the early 1800s were made from real human teeth. Yes, real. Salvaged from battlefield corpses, purchased from desperate souls, or removed from the mouths of criminals. These so-called Waterloo teeth were set into ivory bases and fitted into wealthy mouths with shocking elegance. They were gruesome in origin, but quite the fashion statement once polished and installed. If you were rich, your dentures could quite literally come from someone else's tragedy. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 created such a surplus of available teeth that entire boxes were shipped to London and Paris. They were boiled, sorted, and delicately arranged by dental artisans. Yes, artisans who shaped ivory, porcelain, or even walrus tusk to cradle each tooth into a full upper or lower set. But ivory had its quirks. Over time, it yellowed. It absorbed moisture. It smelled. And it was prone to cracking under heat or chewing anything more ambitious than a biscuit. Still, it was considered far more refined than wood, which, despite persistent myths, was rarely used in actual dentures. Even George Washington's famous wooden teeth were mostly made of lead and horsebone. You ponder that fact as you quietly retract your mental image of a president gnawing on pine bark. Porcelain offered a gleaming, lifelike alternative. Invented in the late 1700s and perfected in the Victorian era, porcelain teeth had the advantage of visual appeal. They could be tinted, glazed, and shaped to mimic natural enamel. But they came with one deeply unappealing trait. They were fragile. Biting into anything with confidence might result in a sharp crack and a discreet, horrified trip to the drawing room to retrieve a molar from your soup. So, inventors got creative. They tried hardened rubber bases, often made from vulcanite, a material patented by Charles Goodyear in 1851. Vulcanite was dark, durable, and cheap enough to bring dentures within reach of the rising middle class. And it had one big benefit. It didn't taste like bone or smell like old sea creatures. A major win. Still, even vulcanite dentures had their drawbacks. They required careful fitting, which not every dentist could offer. And the color, deep reddish black, didn't look particularly natural, giving some wearers a faintly Dracula-esque grin. Which, if you were attending a candlelit dinner party, might not be ideal. Fitting dentures was an entire ritual. First, an impression was taken, usually with softened wax, held in the mouth until it cooled and hardened. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. That wax mold would then be used to craft a custom-fitting base into which teeth, porcelain, ivory, or otherwise, would be anchored with pins or cement. Some dentures were full sets, others were partials, known as bridge work, designed to anchor onto the remaining natural teeth with tiny metal hooks. And if you had the misfortune of losing all your teeth early, which was more common than you'd think, your dentist might offer you block teeth, carved from a single slab of ivory with grooves to simulate individual teeth. In other words, a dental butter knife. Victorian etiquette guides even had instructions for wearing dentures. Speak slowly, chew gently, never laugh too widely. Don't eat in public if you can help it. Always carry a handkerchief, just in case, and heaven forbid you drop them into your wine glass mid-toast. Though rumor has it, one viscount once did just that, and blamed it on the bubbles. You pause now to appreciate the strange intimacy of dentures, how they were hidden, but also defining. A person's smile, after all, was a symbol of respectability, wealth, and self-care, even if it was stitched together from porcelain and tusk. Dentists of the era marketed their prosthetics with glorious optimism. Advertisements promised painless smiles and teeth so natural you'll forget they're false. One charming ad from 1883 boasts of teeth so finely polished they reflect moonlight. You picture someone reclining romantically in a garden, lips slightly parted, their upper plate gleaming like a cut crystal. There's a fringe story here too, of course, a tiny offshoot on the family tree of Victorian dental weirdness. A traveling dentist named Fergus Plott, known in some small-town newspapers as the Toothsmith, claimed to create dentures from hardened rose petals. No surviving examples exist, and scholars suspect it was either metaphor or madness. But wouldn't it be nice? A mouthful of roses, gently blooming with every smile. And if all else failed? Some Victorians simply opted not to wear dentures at all. They learned to smile with closed lips, to speak carefully, and to avoid certain foods. There was no shame in it, just a quiet practicality. You imagine one such person now, sipping broth, telling stories, and never letting on what's missing behind their lips. Even Queen Victoria reportedly had dental issues, though the royal records are coy. She likely wore partial dentures in her later years, discreetly crafted by royal dentists using the finest materials available. Her portraits show a closed-mouth smile, demure and calculated. And so, you arrive back at the cabinet. Dentures are no longer just medical devices. They are relics of hope, proof that, even in a time of limited options, people sought dignity, expression, and a little comfort in a smiling face. One last glance at the glass case where a delicate ivory plate rests, its teeth smooth and perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but in the flickering light it glows like a crescent moon. And really, what more could you ask for than a moon in your mouth? You lean back again, lulled by the lingering image of that ivory crescent moon tucked quietly beneath the tongue. But even perfect teeth require upkeep. And so the scene shifts to a more practical corner of the Victorian dentist's domain. One less ornamental, more soapy, and just a little grimy. Tonight, you're inspecting the intimate world of dental hygiene, Victorian style. The bristles, powders, pastes, and yes, that one extremely unsettling toothbrush made of badger hair. Because naturally, what better way to greet the morning than with a bit of rodent? Let's begin with the brush itself. If you had one, that is. Many Victorians still cleaned their teeth with cloths, fingernails, or nothing at all. But if you were of the burgeoning middle class, or trying very hard to seem like it, you might possess a toothbrush. It would have a bone or wood handle, often engraved or painted, and the bristles were typically hog hair, horse hair, or, in more boutique sets, badger. Yes, badger. It was praised for its firm but springy nature, which sounds like a mattress review, not something you stick in your mouth before breakfast. You imagine one now, the coarse bristles stiff and wild, as if the badger hadn't quite finished resisting. Toothbrushes were not disposable either. Oh no. These were durable, sometimes heirloom items. The heads were not removable. When the bristles wore down after months or even years of faithful service, you didn't replace them. You simply brushed harder, or boiled the whole thing and hoped for the best. As for toothpaste, well, it didn't come in a tidy tube just yet. Instead, you'd use a powder, dry, chalky, often gritty. The typical ingredients included crushed charcoal, brick dust, powdered cuttlefish bone, and bicarbonate of soda. Flavoring came courtesy of peppermint oil, clove oil, or, in posh homes, powdered myrrh. Some contained salt. Some even contained soap. Victorian advertisements for tooth powders were dazzlingly optimistic. One boasted breath of roses, enamel like porcelain. Another insisted its powder could restore youth to your gums. Historians quietly point out that brick dust probably didn't do your enamel any favors. Still, the sensation of scrubbed clean teeth, even if slightly eroded, was too satisfying to give up. Some households made their own mixtures. A popular home recipe called for burnt bread crusts ground to ash and mixed with honey. Others included chalk or even gunpowder. Just a pinch, of course. Nothing says minty fresh like the faint tang of battlefield residue. If you were feeling extra virtuous, you might scrape your tongue with a silver spoon, or swish vinegar and salt to sterilize the mouth. And don't forget the toothpick, a daily tool for removing post-meal reminders. These were carved from ivory, silver, or even quill tips. The wealthier classes kept ornate sets in little velvet boxes, often tucked into travel kits or vanity drawers. One particularly curious item is the tooth key, an instrument usually reserved for extractions but occasionally misused for preventative maintenance. Designed to resemble an old door key, this corkscrew-like device was inserted around a tooth and twisted sharply to pull it free. Some overly enthusiastic hygienists believed it could be used to wiggle loose a problem tooth early, sparing future pain. Unfortunately, they sometimes removed perfectly healthy teeth in the process. Of course, brushing wasn't the only defense against decay. The Victorian diet played a major role in dental health. Those in rural areas with limited access to refined sugar often kept their teeth well into old age. In contrast, the sugar boom, sweet teas, jams, toffees, and cordial wines took a visible toll in urban mouths. Dentists in cities reported a marked rise in toothaches among the newly wealthy. There's something poetically tragic about finally affording dessert, only to lose your molars to it. For children, the situation was particularly bleak. Few parents enforced brushing rituals, and sweets were handed out liberally to keep them quiet during long sermons or train rides. One popular treat, licorice root, sold in sticks that doubled as chew toys. They may have tasted nice, but they left a sticky residue that invited every cavity-causing microbe in London to host a banquet. Some teachers began encouraging classroom brushing, an act of revolutionary health zeal at the time. A few schools even gave out tiny wooden brushes as prizes, but these efforts were limited, inconsistent, and often mocked. No boy of pride would be caught scrubbing his own teeth, one journal noted, unless it was for a girl's admiration or to avoid the dentist's pincers. Dentists themselves promoted hygiene through traveling lectures. In church halls or public houses, they gave dramatic presentations, often with large wax models of human jaws. These puppet-like props demonstrated proper brushing technique, flossing, with silk thread no less, and how to avoid tooth loss entirely. By visiting your dentist more often, naturally, you can imagine the scene. A dim room, the flicker of a lantern slide projector, a man with mutton chops solemnly holding a toothbrush aloft, while children snicker in the back row. One Victorian hygiene lecturer reportedly ended his talks by brushing his own teeth on stage, then spitting theatrically into a silver basin. Unforgettable, if nothing else. For all this, however, oral hygiene was still viewed by many as an indulgence. Teeth were expected to fail eventually, like hair or hearing, something to be endured rather than maintained. But this belief was slowly changing, and the toothbrush quietly was becoming a symbol, not just of cleanliness, but of discipline, modernity, and upward mobility. A curious fringe detail. Some Victorians believed brushing too much could provoke romantic hysteria, a fluttery kind of nervous energy allegedly brought on by over-grooming. One physician warned against vigorous horizontal brushing, claiming it stirred unladylike excitements. Tooth care apparently had its risks. But you don't worry about that now. You imagine your badger hair brush resting quietly on the basin's edge, your tin of tooth powder gleaming with pride. You run your tongue along the imaginary smoothness of clean teeth and breathe in the faint scent of clove and coal dust. It's not just hygiene, it's a ritual, a pause in the day, a moment between toast crumbs and moonlight where you say to yourself, I exist and I am polishing proof. That's how it begins, every day and every night. A scratchy brush, a stinging rinse, a final breath, and the slow, steady sense that perhaps, just perhaps, your teeth will carry you one day further into the story. Let the bristled hush of the toothbrush fade behind you now, slipping gently into the shadows. The basin is quiet, the silver rinsed clean. But you're still here, in the softly lit back room of our imaginary Victorian dentist's practice, where drawers creak open and reveal secrets that have long since lost their voices. Tonight, you explore something rather marvelous and rather absurd, the strange and delicate world of Victorian dental advertising. Because what better way to lull you into sleep than by reading the fine print on a jar of mint-flavored hope? The Victorians, bless their industrious little hearts, advertised with passion. Even dentistry, yes, dentistry, became an arena for dazzling claims, dreamy illustrations, and promises so far-fetched they made snake oil look like a thoughtful purchase. They knew how to dress up dental care with velvet gloves and golden ink. You didn't just brush your teeth, you rejuvenated your soul. Or so they wanted you to believe. Picture this: a broadside pasted onto a gaslit wall in 1872. A well-groomed gentleman smiles toothily from the illustration, his incisors positively gleaming. In one hand, he brandishes a canister labeled Dr. Fitzwarren's dentifrice paste. In the other, a scroll that reads, Teeth like marble, breath like spring rain. Quite a claim for a jar full of chalk, baking soda, and peppermint oil. Every dental product needed a flourish. Some advertised enamel elixirs that promised to regrow lost molars. Others offered gum fortifiers with ingredients that remain delightfully mysterious. The real star, though, was branding. Bottles, tins, and powder boxes were designed with more care than some wedding invitations. Embossed lettering, delicate filigree, pastoral scenes where maidens clean their teeth in rose gardens. In London shop windows, you'd find entire displays dedicated to these products, shelves of shimmering labels and stacked tins, each promising beauty, health, and marital success. Some of them even came with mirrors built into the lid, for dental reflection, of course, or possibly for admiring your ability to afford such finery. And the names, oh, the names. You had Pearl White's Enamel Luster, the Imperial Dentifrice of Edinburgh, and, my personal favorite, Colonel Gumption's Naval Tooth Crystals. The latter, one assumes, appeal to sailors and landlubbers alike. Who wouldn't want a naval-grade smile? These ads were full of charming overstatements. Testimonials claimed miraculous transformations after just one brushing. One woman from Kent allegedly won a beauty contest after using a certain powder for 3 days. Another swore her sore gums were cured, and her fiancé stopped snoring. It's unclear how those two events were related, but the implication was obvious. This powder changed everything. And who could forget the charming celebrity endorsements? Early Victorian dentists were clever enough to advertise who their famous clients were, especially actors, singers, and even a duke or two. One London dentist's shingle proclaimed, "By appointment to her ladyship, the Countess of Harrogate." No one quite knew who she was, but it sounded fancy. And that was enough. Advertising also worked hard to stoke your anxieties. An 1861 ad warned, "The mouth neglected is the doorway to ruin." Another simply stated, "A gentleman's reputation begins with his breath." And then there was the delightfully blunt, "Don't die toothless." Even dentists themselves became brands. Their calling cards were little works of art, printed on thick cardstock with gold edges and illustrated with smiling cherubs, elegant fonts, and more titles than a Victorian novel. Professor Henry Atherton, master of dental science, extractor of pains, inventor of the luster clamp, specialist in vulcanite wonders. One almost hoped to suffer a toothache just for the experience. But behind all the theater, there was strategy. The Victorian dental market was becoming crowded, and competition was fierce, especially after the boom in mail-order catalogs, where customers from Manchester to Mumbai could order their own tooth powders by post. These companies competed not just on ingredients, but on image. One powder boasted that it was scented for the Queen's own maids. Another offered a travel-safe formula for railway journeys. Yet another insisted its users experienced dreamless sleep and morning confidence. Imagine brushing your way to an entire personality upgrade. This was also an era of do-it-yourself dentistry, and advertising made sure to cater to the brave. Ads for home tooth extraction kits, yes, really, promised pain-free removal in the privacy of one's parlor. You'd get a tiny pliers-like tool, a cloth, and instructions written in the most polite language imaginable. Gently but firmly rotate the tool with confidence, being sure to grip the offending molar alone. Not you will scream, just with confidence. And yes, these kits sold reasonably well. Confidence, after all, is a powerful marketing tool. There was even a fringe market, barely legal, often frowned upon, of tooth bleaching tinctures. These were made of highly questionable chemicals, including oxalic acid, and were rumored to cause more pain than results. But if you lived by candlelight and only smiled in moderation, perhaps it worked. Oddly, many dental ads also doubled as literature. Some featured entire fictional stories, a lonely governess who finds love after fixing her breath, a soldier returning home whose smile wins back his sweetheart. It's bedtime propaganda, really, but charmingly so. What's most fascinating is how advertising shaped public attitudes. Dentists were no longer just shadowy figures in back alleys with pliers. They became gentlemen professionals, purveyors of health, guardians of beauty. They didn't just fix teeth, they elevated you. Even the poor were courted. Ads began to promise affordable care for factory families and safe treatments on modest terms. It wasn't entirely sincere, but it was a shift. Dentistry, once a luxury or a last resort, was now being painted as a right, one your enamel deserved. As you picture one of those little tins on a shop shelf, dusty but dignified, you understand the strange tenderness of it all. A culture trying to convince itself that even the grimmest parts of the body could be polished, perfumed, and proudly sold. Perhaps that's what advertising was best at during this time, wrapping terror in tinsel. Because dental care was still painful, still inconsistent, still tinged with the whiff of clove oil and fear. But if the label said fresh breath and poetic smiles, well, who were you to argue? You drift now past posters and placards, tin boxes and cheeky slogans, their ink fading like the evening sky. One last whisper from a label reads, "For teeth that speak volumes," and then it's quiet. The last echoes of gleaming smiles and paper-thin promises slip into darkness as the gaslight dims behind you. You turn the corner now, stepping into quieter territory, a room where hope fades slightly into necessity, a space where comfort surrenders to correction. Because now, dear listener, you find yourself facing the wires, screws, and unsettling ambition of Victorian orthodontics. If you thought braces were a modern inconvenience, allow yourself a soft chuckle. Victorians, in their eternal confidence, had already begun their crusade for dental order, and like most of their endeavors, it was done with equal parts scientific enthusiasm, cosmetic obsession, and a faint disregard for patient comfort. You settle into an overstuffed chair, leather, a bit cracked, with that medicinal whiff of eugenol and pipe smoke, and watch as the tools are laid out before you. Slender wire coils, tiny gold clasps, a frightening thing that looks like a miniature man-trap, except it's meant for your mouth. All very precise, all very Victorian. Orthodontics in this era was still in its relative infancy, but its ambition knew no bounds. Straight teeth weren't merely cosmetic. They were thought to indicate discipline, rationality, even moral virtue. A crooked smile? That was a character flaw. Best to have it corrected, and soon. One popular apparatus was the regulating plate, which sounds like a polite dinner setting, but was actually a mouth-filling contraption made of gold or vulcanite. It pushed or pulled teeth using wires or springs, and could be customized by tightening tiny screws. By the dentist, of course, or, in some rare cases, by the patient themselves at home. Imagine being handed a tiny spanner and told to tighten your own mouth every Wednesday. A little more to the left. There you go. Lovely. Some models required headgear. These weren't sleek or discreet. Picture leather straps buckled behind the head, with iron loops attaching to the teeth. It looked more like horse tack than healthcare, but it was all for progress. Historians still debate whether these early orthodontic devices were effective or largely ceremonial. Some claim moderate success, particularly when used on children whose bones were still pliable. Others point out that without anesthesia or antibiotics, the risk of infection or unintended damage was high. What's certain is this: they were determined to try. Interestingly, Most of these devices weren't hidden. They were worn with stoicism, even pride. A sign that you were wealthy enough to care about appearances, that your family believed in the future of your smile. There's a strange kind of dignity in that. Metal and leather and gold, shining not just as correction, but aspiration. You'll be pleased to know that some innovations were surprisingly gentle. One fringe orthodontist in Glasgow designed a silk thread traction system. It used soft tension applied daily with fresh silk, like weaving your teeth into place. Sound mad? Probably was. But his notes describe dozens of satisfied patients, and at least one who used the technique to close a front tooth gap just in time for a wedding. Of course, not every method was so elegant. There's record of a French dentist working in London who relied on heat. Yes, heat. He would warm gold wires in a small spirit lamp before applying them to the patient's mouth, claiming the warmth made the teeth more receptive. It also made the patients very sweaty and wide-eyed. This approach, mercifully, did not catch on, and we mustn't forget the biting regulator, a rather unsettling tool that looked like a thick mouthguard crossed with a medieval clamp. Patients were instructed to bite down on it for several hours a day. It reshaped the jaw, allegedly. In reality, it often just made chewing painful. But pain, in Victorian dentistry, was seen less as a warning and more as a form of participation. Some dentists dabbled in more creative interventions. One particularly eccentric figure, a Dr. Venn in Brighton, believed the tongue could be trained to push teeth into place. He prescribed elaborate tongue exercises, including nightly routines that involved licking the roof of the mouth for 30 minutes straight. Patients were also asked to recite certain sounds, la, as part of their orthodontic workout. Did it work? Unclear, but it likely improved elocution, if nothing else. Orthodontic patients were usually children and adolescents, which meant their complaints were more easily dismissed. Whining, one dentist called it. Another wrote in his notes that a child will forget all hardship when presented with a sugar biscuit. Modern ethics would likely frown on this, but back then, biscuits were a standard post-adjustment bribe. And, just as with everything Victorian, there was fashion. Braces became a sign of rising status. Some mothers even requested small pearls be embedded in their daughters' orthodontic devices. One 1889 London society girl had gold loops with tiny opals. Dental jewelry wasn't new, of course. Humans had been adorning their teeth for centuries. But here it took on a modern twist, a functional sparkle, a corrective glitter. Orthodontics also found its way into literature and society columns. Etiquette manuals advised young ladies to complete their dental refinement before their second season. Gentlemen's journals published interviews with dentists on the ideal masculine jawline. Satirical cartoons showed overcorrected aristocrats with perfect artificial grins, lampooning a society that had finally found a way to suffer for symmetry. Behind the absurdity, though, was a real shift. Dentistry was becoming preventive, not just reactive. The very idea of orthodontics suggested something deeply optimistic, that problems could be solved before they hurt, that a child with crooked teeth didn't have to suffer toothaches and ridicule for life. They could be adjusted, realigned, improved. Even the military took note. There are reports, though rarely confirmed, that certain branches began inspecting recruits' teeth, not just for rot, but for symmetry. A straight bite, it was believed, implied discipline, order, national vigor. If true, that would make braces the tiniest badge of empire. One final oddity. There was a brief Victorian trend of faking orthodontic wear. Yes, some young people, mostly girls, wore false braces to appear as though they were undergoing treatment. Much like false spectacles or padded calves, it was a way to look studious, refined, upwardly mobile. If braces meant you could afford a dentist, then who wouldn't want the look? Even if it meant clipping a bit of bent wire behind your teeth and smiling through the ache. So, you leave the room now, the chair empty, the coils gently unwinding in your memory. You pass the mirror, pausing to imagine your reflection with a full Victorian headgear ensemble, and you grin. Crooked or not, you've seen what it meant to try. Straight teeth may have been the goal, but it was never just about alignment. It was about shaping futures with wires and willpower, about bending discomfort into beauty, about seeing what wasn't yet perfect and deciding, yes. Let's begin. You leave the faint metallic taste of orthodontics behind, the echoes of springs and screws dissolving into velvet shadows. The hallway curves again, gently now, like the soft bend of a molar root beneath the gum. You've arrived at a space that hums with gentle urgency, where water glistens, gauze is folded like origami, and something sharp waits quietly at the edge of vision. Tonight, you are slipping into the realm of early dental surgery, the surprisingly delicate, slightly chaotic world of Victorian tooth extractions, root work, and those unfortunate moments when things went not quite as planned. It starts, as many things do, with a quiet sigh. A patient arrives, hunched slightly, holding one cheek. They murmur their symptoms to a receptionist who doubles as the dentist's niece. There's been a throbbing, a tenderness, a pain that kept them up last night, counting ceiling cracks and praying to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. And yes, that's a real thing. You're in good company. Dental surgery in the Victorian era sat on a fine line between art and improvisation. Some practitioners had formal training. Others had simply declared themselves skilled. The law was still catching up. Official dental licenses wouldn't be regulated until 1878 in the UK, which meant that for much of the 1800s, your dentist might also be your barber, your local apothecary, or, in one charming case, your town's violin instructor. Steady hands were transferable, apparently. The most common procedure by far was the tooth extraction, usually performed without anesthetic until well into the mid-century. You were expected to sit still, breathe shallowly, and hold on to the arms of your chair with conviction. The dentist, meanwhile, would select their weapon of choice from a shining tray. The forceps, of course, or perhaps the dreaded dental key. Ah yes, the dental key. It looked like a cross between a wine bottle opener and something you'd find in a pirate's toolkit. The idea was to hook it around the tooth and twist, lifting the offending enamel like a cork. Did it always go well? Not exactly. It had a reputation for snapping roots, cracking adjacent teeth, or, in one notable case, fracturing a jaw. Still, it was fast, and in an era where time was pain, that counted for something. For patients with a stronger constitution, or perhaps just fewer options, there were other surgical offerings. Root amputations, for instance. This involved removing the infected root of a tooth while leaving the crown intact. In theory, you kept your smile and lost the ache. In practice, it often ended with the entire tooth coming out anyway. But points for optimism. Even more daring were the early apicoectomies, removal of the tip of a tooth's root, usually through a small incision in the gum. These were performed with long, curved instruments and a steady drip of carbolic acid, which was thought to sterilize the area. You can imagine the scent, like a wound at a pine-scented holiday market. Dentists were increasingly keen to operate cleanly. By the 1860s, the principles of antiseptic surgery, championed by people like Joseph Lister, began to creep into dentistry. Some practices used phenol or iodine. Others simply boiled their tools between patients, which felt radical at the time. But progress was progress, even if it came with a faint aroma of burnt cotton and rust. There were also surgical oddities that veered into the realm of the improbable. One Victorian dentist claimed to have relieved a patient of 14 consecutive teeth in one sitting. The patient apparently walked out smiling. This is either a bold fabrication or proof that the human body has a very specific definition of resilience. Another account describes the removal of a calcified cyst the size of a walnut from the jaw of a railway porter. The dentist kept it in a jar for the rest of his career, as a teaching aid, he said, or maybe just as a conversation starter at dinner parties. Victorian surgery didn't stop at teeth. Some practitioners performed full jaw resections for infections that had spread into the bone. This was, understandably, a grim procedure, with outcomes ranging from miraculous to tragic. Historians still debate whether these surgeries were brave, necessary, or a touch too ambitious. The answer is probably yes to all three. What's fascinating is how much of this was done under minimal anesthesia. Ether had been discovered by the 1840s, but it was unpredictable and, in some cases, explosive. Chloroform was more popular in dental offices, but its dosage was a dark art. Too little, and the patient screamed. Too much, and, well, the dental chair became a permanent fixture. For many, the preferred sedative remained alcohol, prayer, or an extremely tight grip on the chair's armrests. Yet, amid all this, there were moments of gentleness. Some dentists developed a technique called gradual extraction. They would wiggle the tooth ever so slightly over a series of visits until it loosened and could be removed painlessly. Time-consuming? Yes, but patients reportedly adored this approach. It felt humane, like someone was finally listening to their gums. And then there were the gentle practitioners. One Dr. Pembroke, who practiced in Bath, insisted on playing piano music during extractions. Live, in the office. His sister would perform soothing waltzes as patients braved the chair. Another dentist read poetry during procedures. We don't know if it helped, but it certainly provided a distraction from the pliers. Some fringe theorists even dabbled in magnetism. They believed certain metals, held at specific points on the body, could dull pain or prevent bleeding. This likely didn't work. But if someone waved a copper rod over your ear while preparing to pull a molar, it might have distracted you long enough to forget to be afraid. Dental surgery, despite its crude tools, was moving towards something nobler. It wasn't just about yanking out rot. It was about preserving, salvaging, refining. By the late Victorian era, dentists were documenting their cases with pride. Photographs, sketches, wax models. They were building a body of knowledge tooth by tooth, patient by patient. And you, nestled now in your imagined surgical chair, can feel the quiet dignity of that pursuit. The gentler surgeries, the careful hands, the chalkboard notes written in neat copperplate. Tooth 27, repaired with gold and patience. Prognosis, cheerful. Let yourself rest a moment longer with those words. In a world of pain and pulling, they had already begun to whisper something different. A promise of care, of healing, of becoming whole again. You rise slowly from the surgical chair, teeth intact, or perhaps a few less than before, but the air feels different now. Less clinical, more calculated. This next room smells faintly of ink and ambition. There's something studious about it. Cabinets line the walls, filled with bottles, each labeled in looping script: chloral hydrate, tincture of myrrh, peppermint oil. You're not in a dental theater anymore. You've stepped into the curious corner of Victorian dental pharmacology. Because before Novocaine, before acetaminophen or numbing gels that taste like overripe banana, there was a pharmacist's wonderland of powders, potions, and pastes. And dentists, ever resourceful, dabbled in all of them. In the soft amber of this apothecary-lit space, you sit at a counter cluttered with mortar and pestle, twisted glass droppers, and thick syrups the color of overboiled toffee. Here, you begin to learn the delicate art of quieting pain, Victorian style. Let's begin with opium, shall we? It was everywhere. If you had a cavity, a cracked molar, or a general sense of toothish discomfort, you might be given a tincture of opium, laudanum being the most popular form. A few drops directly on the tooth or into a sugar cube. The pain faded. So, eventually, did your memory of the appointment. It worked. It also made you slightly philosophical, depending on the dose. Then there was cocaine. Yes, that cocaine. By the 1880s, it had made its way into dentistry as a topical anesthetic. A dab on the gum and, presto, numbness. Pure relief. Dentists considered it a modern miracle, and some even kept a small silver spoon in their pocket for patient use. The problem? Cocaine is rather Moorish. By the end of the century, dentists had begun to notice that patients were returning more for the medication than the actual dental work. Peppermint and clove oil were less dangerous, but just as essential. Clove oil in particular had antiseptic properties and a numbing effect. It became the go-to remedy for toothaches at home and in the clinic. A cotton pellet soaked in clove oil, tucked gently against the gum, sharp at first, then soothing. You still find it in dental supplies today. The scent lingers, like nostalgia distilled. Quinine sometimes made an appearance, particularly when pain was thought to be feverish. It didn't do much for teeth, but it calmed patients, especially those with overlapping bouts of malaria. Yes, that's right. Victorian dentists had to treat patients who might be mid-mosquito fever, while also clutching a cracked incisor. An inconvenient combination, but not unheard of. One curious concoction was chlorodyne, a patented elixir that promised to treat everything from cramps to coughs to neuralgia of the jaw. Its exact formula was a guarded secret, but historians believe it contained a jolly mix of morphine, cannabis extract, and chloroform. Take 2 teaspoons, and either your pain or your will to argue disappears, maybe both. And then there were powders, some meant for cleaning, others for calming. Dentifrice powders often contained baking soda, crushed oyster shells, or even brick dust. One brand, charmingly titled Dr. Crumb's Pearl Polish, guaranteed a brilliant shine and marital success. Whether the two were connected remained unproven. Tooth powders were flavored with everything from fennel to powdered charcoal to, oddly, powdered cuttlefish bone. This last ingredient helped scrub plaque and offered a bit of calcium to boot. Of course, it also meant your dental hygiene smelled faintly like the back room of a Victorian fishmonger. Still, some patients required something stronger. For extreme cases, those suffering from infected pulps or bone inflammation, dentists reached for creosote. Derived from tar, creosote was an antiseptic and analgesic. It burned, fiercely. But it worked, and its smell, sharp, bitter, like smoldering wood. became a marker of serious treatment. You knew the dentist meant business when the creosote bottle came out. Yet not every remedy was medicinal. Some were pure performance. A small number of dentists, particularly in London and Edinburgh, added colored solutions to their elixirs, not for effectiveness, but to impress. Blue mouthwash? That's refined. A ruby red gargle? Why, you must be visiting a very posh dentist indeed. The Victorians loved a visual flourish, even if it left you tasting like cough syrup and beetroot. Not all substances were chosen with care. Mercury was still used in some fillings, and even in minor antiseptic pastes, despite its risks being vaguely understood. Historians have unearthed several grim cases of mercury poisoning disguised as nervous decline. When the mind begins to unravel, it's easy to blame hysteria. Fewer people check the molars. Historians still debate the long-term impact of these pharmacological choices. Some argue that the ready access to opiates and cocaine led to waves of addiction masked as chronic dental trouble. Others suggest that without these substances, Victorian dentistry would have been impossibly cruel. Pain management was, after all, in its infancy, and a patient in agony was unlikely to return, let alone pay. Interestingly, there was an overlap between dental and veterinary pharmacology. Some painkillers used on horses found their way into dental practices. One 1871 manual mentions laudanum for equine molar abscess, only to list the same dosage for adult humans. You had to hope your dentist knew which bottle he'd grabbed. And there were fringe cures, of course. Always. Some practitioners favored homeopathic drops, tiny tinctures diluted past recognition. Others used hypnotism, claiming to dull pain through suggestion. One flamboyant London dentist swore by aromatic mesmerism, in which he waved scented handkerchiefs under the patient's nose while murmuring encouragement. Did it work? Possibly. Or the patient simply fainted from the lavender oil and lack of breakfast. One popular folk remedy involved placing a slice of raw onion on the wrist, secured with cloth. It was said to draw out the ache. Another had patients clench a clove of garlic between their toes. These remedies, charming as they sound, were usually performed while waiting desperately for an actual appointment. Still, through all of it, the potions, the powders, the occasional misplaced veterinary vial, something lovely was happening. Pharmacology was evolving. Pain was no longer divine punishment or moral failure. It was a condition to be managed, reduced, even if the dose was just right, eliminated. As you gaze across the shelf-lined room, you see more than labels. You see an era inventing relief in real time. Bottles once held with trembling hands, powders mixed in the middle of the night, syrups poured with the hopeful steadiness of someone trying to make things better. Tonight, you've walked through the apothecary doors and learned that healing doesn't always look clean. Sometimes it's sticky, smelly, slightly narcotic. But it's a start. A clove-soaked cotton ball against a roaring tooth. A gentle hush in a world not yet quiet. The air feels different now, drier, more metallic, with the scent of something faintly waxy and formal. You've wandered into the part of history that doesn't whisper so much as it poses, stiffly in a studio chair. Here, under gaslight and between velvet drapes, sits the strangest kind of patient. One no longer in need of anesthesia, apologies, or a follow-up appointment. Welcome to the quiet corridors of Victorian dental museums and the eerie world of teaching specimens. This is the part of the story where teeth no longer ache. They simply exist, suspended in glass, labeled in looping ink. sometimes mounted with disturbing pride. The Victorian obsession with cataloging the human experience didn't stop at botany, geology, or butterflies. Teeth, it turns out, made perfect collectibles, and even better teaching tools. Picture this. You're standing in a tiny room tucked behind a reputable London dental school. There's a cabinet, rosewood perhaps, or dark walnut, lined with small drawers. You open one slowly. Inside, nestled on velvet, is a full upper denture, carved from hippopotamus ivory. The gums are stained a genteel pink. The molars are faintly yellowed. They belonged to someone once, perhaps an admiral, perhaps a clergyman. Now they smile into eternity. Dental teaching collections began sprouting up across Europe in the mid-1800s, often fueled by generous donations or morbid acquisitions. Every dental school worth its salt had at least a few wax models of diseases, a syphilitic jaw here, an impacted molar there. These weren't just instructional, they were status symbols. A particularly rare pathology could be passed around a lecture hall like a relic. In Paris, one dentist built a full room dedicated to congenital dental deformities. Think twisted roots, duplicated incisors, and the haunting smile of cleft palate wax busts. Students were instructed to sketch these anomalies by candlelight, committing every shadowed contour to memory. To understand is to draw, their professors insisted. Some of those drawings remain today, tucked into the backs of dissection notebooks like anatomical love letters. You might be wondering, where did all these specimens come from? Well, that's where things get interesting. Some were donated. A patient, grateful for a successful extraction, might allow the removed tooth to be studied. Others, especially in the early years, were not so voluntarily contributed. The bodies of unclaimed paupers often served the dual purposes of anatomical dissection and dental instruction. In fact, several preserved jaws in 19th century archives have been traced back to local workhouses. Notably, these specimens were almost never labeled with names, just ages, initials, and conditions. And then, of course, there were the live models. A particularly cooperative patient might be invited to sit in on a lecture. Their unique dental issue explained to the class in clinical detail. For a small fee, of course. In exchange, they received treatment, sometimes even for free. Whether that treatment was successful or merely enthusiastic varies depending on which dusty ledger you read. But let's step away from the darker corners and back into the waxworks. These were true art. Artists, many trained in theatrical prosthetics, were commissioned to sculpt uncanny models of diseased gums, abscesses, or misshapen palates. The wax was tinted with pigments made from crushed beetles, ochre, and even dried blood. That unsettling glisten, a final coat of varnish mixed with resin and beeswax. Dentists learned from these models. Patients feared them. Children stared wide-eyed when they accidentally glimpsed them on a desk. You, dear listener, might feel a similar sensation now. A shiver of fascination paired with an urge to look away. Perfectly natural. And then we come to the phantom heads. Yes, that's what they were called. Phantom heads were mechanical skulls mounted on stands, with detachable jaws and rubber gums. Some had glass eyes for dramatic effect. Dental students practiced their techniques on these mock patients, inserting forceps into grinning maws under the watchful eye of their professors. The heads didn't scream. They didn't flinch. They simply waited, eternally cooperative. One rare model even came with a tiny crank. When turned, it caused the jaws to gently chew. To simulate resistance, the instruction manual explained. Historians still wonder what kind of student could keep a straight face while being gummed to death by a wooden automaton in a wig. Museums weren't limited to academic settings either. By the late 1800s, traveling dental exhibitions became popular among the public. These curious shows toured provincial towns, displaying tools, denture samples, and even jars of famous teeth. One London display boasted possession of a molar once belonging to Lord Byron. Was it really? Who knows? But it brought in the crowds. There was also a growing market for dental oddities in private collections. Gentlemen collectors, already fond of skulls and shrunken heads, began acquiring rare teeth or full dental prostheses. A ruby inlaid incisor, a child's baby tooth encased in crystal. One catalog lists a denture of French aristocrat with porcelain molars and gold filigree, as though it were a Fabergé egg. And in a way, it was. Dentists themselves weren't immune to this allure. Many proudly displayed their Hall of Horrors in their waiting rooms, not to frighten, though that was a likely side effect, but to educate. A subtle reminder: brush your teeth, or end up like this wax jaw with 12 abscesses and a built-in lesson plan. Historians still debate the ethics of these collections. Were they morbid, inspirational, exploitative? They likely straddled all three categories. But what's undeniable is their influence. These museums, whether hidden in back rooms or proudly displayed, shaped generations of dental knowledge. They taught students to recognize the early signs of disease. They demystified oral surgery. They offered a kind of immortality to those who suffered. And now you walk quietly among them. You pause beside a glass case. Inside, a full set of porcelain teeth nestled in a velvet-lined box. The note says they belong to an opera singer, worn only on stage. Below it, a jawbone speckled with dark splotches, evidence of advanced periodontitis. It looks peaceful now, silent. You feel something odd, not revulsion, but a strange gratitude. These specimens, however strange, were gifts of knowledge. Little chapters in the story of how we learned to help, to heal, to prevent, rather than merely endure. You step back from the case, past the phantom heads and waxen mouths, and into the quiet once more. You're not afraid. You're just curiously comforted, and maybe a little sleepy. Now the room feels warmer, and not from any fire or gaslight. It's the warmth of routine, of waiting room patience and everyday fuss. You've wandered out of the museum and into a different sort of chamber altogether. Less eerie, more absurd. A place of linoleum floors, teacups rattling on saucers, and the anxious shuffle of stiff crinoline skirts. Welcome to the Victorian dental waiting room, where the real drama unfolds before the dentist ever lifts a tool. This is where dentistry becomes theater. You find yourself in a modest parlor, likely repurposed from a drawing room or back office. There's a framed engraving of Queen Victoria on one wall, flanked by an etching of Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, on the other. A shelf of dusty etiquette manuals droops under the weight of a houseplant trying its best. The chairs are overstuffed and undercushioned, clearly designed more for posture than comfort. And yet, here they sit. The hopeful, the reluctant, the dreadfully resigned. Victorian dental waiting rooms were unique spaces, equal parts medical limbo and social theater. The rules of politeness still applied. No screaming, minimal moaning, and absolutely no complaints about the previous patient. But beneath the surface, etiquette churned a tangle of nerves, judgments, and quiet battles with impending discomfort. You're seated next to a woman in gloves, tapping her parasol against the floor in a staccato rhythm. She's faking calm. Her jaw clenches every fourth tap. Across from her, a boy dangles his legs, trying not to cry. His governess whispers promises of barley sugar afterward, and over by the window, an older man snores lightly, clearly drugged, or possibly just bravely indifferent. Reading material is limited but specific. The Illustrated Dental Journal, a copy of Hints on Teeth, and a few outdated issues of Punch magazine featuring cartoons of gap-toothed gentry. They don't make for light reading, but they do provide a convenient distraction. Especially if your tooth is doing that rhythmic throb, it saves for moments like these. And of course, there's the bell. That little chime that signals the next patient is to rise and vanish into the unknown. It's always a surprise, even if you know it's coming. It makes conversation pause mid-word. The entire room holds its breath. A name is called, usually a surname, though occasionally a gentle Mrs. Bellamy will echo with faint empathy. Someone stands, skirts are smoothed, collars are adjusted, and off they go, through the wooden door that creaks like it knows what's waiting on the other side. The rest of you look anywhere but at each other. It's in these rooms that the full absurdity of Victorian dental expectations becomes clear. Patients weren't just here to be treated. They were here to perform their pain with decorum. You were expected to be stoic, dignified, and ideally silent about the whole thing. Women, in particular, were discouraged from expressing dental anxiety. To do so might invite suspicion of female nerves, and those could lead to something far worse than a toothache, a prescription for rest cures and prolonged convalescence. Some wealthier practices provided amusements to distract waiting clients, wind-up automata, paintings with hidden compartments, or, if the dentist fancied himself, an aesthete, a pianola in the corner playing dampened waltzes. But most simply offered tea, weak, tepid tea, with milk if you were lucky and sugar if your remaining molars could manage it. Children, meanwhile, faced their own unique dread. Victorian childhood was no sanctuary from dental intervention. If anything, it came with a peculiar twist. Many believed that extracting milk teeth too early could lead to better adult teeth. This led to the rather disturbing practice of precautionary extractions, where a dentist, armed with moral certainty, removed perfectly healthy baby teeth. To make room, they'd say. For what exactly was never entirely explained. Parents sat with children, but not always in solidarity. Some watched approvingly as their offspring braved the ordeal. Others looked away, unwilling to witness what they had themselves endured at that same age. A few even offered bribes, half a crown, a sweetmeat, a longer ride home in the carriage. It all depended on whether the child screamed. Screaming was frowned upon, of course, but it happened. Often. There's a scholarly debate over whether waiting rooms contributed to a kind of communal dental anxiety, passed between patients like a whispered rumor. Historians still argue about it. Some believe that shared dread amplified the fear, while others suggest it provided comfort, that knowing others suffered too made it somehow bearable. Of course, not everyone feared the dentist. There were those who loved the attention, the ceremony, the thrill of being the day's main event. One society columnist once described her dental visit as a personal opera in 3 acts: numbness, extraction, and applause. Some fashionable ladies even timed their visits to coincide with known socialites, hoping for impromptu gossip or a glimpse of a duke's dental hygiene. And let's not forget the dental braggers. Those who return to the waiting room post-treatment with a too casual grin, announcing, "Oh, he only pulled two," or "didn't feel a thing really." Liars, perhaps, or at least fabulists, but necessary ones. They gave the others something to hold on to, hope, or spite, or a vague sense that if he could do it, so could you. Occasionally, someone would lose their nerve, quietly slip out, make a hasty excuse, an urgent telegram, a prior engagement, a sudden recognition that the pain wasn't that bad after all. Dentists called them door ghosts. Their names stayed on the day's list, crossed out in pencil. Most never returned. Meanwhile, the room itself watched. Waiting rooms developed personalities over time. You'd recognize them by their chairs, their window views, their peculiar smells. One in Brighton was known for its lilac perfume, overpowering enough to mask the scent of antiseptic and anxiety. Another in Leeds boasted a marble bust with a missing tooth, as if mocking those yet to enter. And now, in this imagined waiting room, you too wait, feeling that odd blend of dread and detachment. It's peaceful, in a way. Nothing to do but sit, think, breathe. You watch the door swing open and another patient vanish. The bell doesn't ring this time. It only hums gently. You're not afraid. You're curious. And slightly numb, though you're not sure whether it's from tension or time. The waiting room continues to hold you, cradled in its Victorian stillness. Just beyond that creaking door lies the next chapter. But for now, you stay here a little longer. You find yourself once more in that familiar gaslit parlor, the same velvet chaise cradling you as you drift toward the final chapter of this sprawling nocturnal odyssey. Here, the tools no longer gleam with novelty, but instead hum with legacy. Every gently whirring drill, every tarnished forceps, each brass-handled key carrying echoes of lives lived, fears allayed, and futures shaped. Tonight, you consider how these gentle twinges from Victorian dentists have rippled through time, guiding us toward the slick, sanitized modernity of today. Imagine a young Victorian child, cheeks flushed from a sugar-laden pudding, accidentally spiking a fang with a searing cavity. That child's mother, frantic, would have consulted the local surgeon in minutes. A brisk extraction, laudanum on a sugar cube, and a passive acceptance that tomorrow's smile would bear the scar of sacrifice. That was the mainstream reality. A world in which tooth loss was so expected that losing a molar by adolescence was nearly as common as catching a cold. You see their world now. No fluoridated water, no mass-produced toothbrushes, and limited understanding of bacterial causes. In the 1890s, the average British adult had fewer than 14 functional teeth left, testament to dietary shifts and emerging industrial sugars. Yet, this was normal. This is the fact you're gently absorbing, a reminder of how far we've come. And yet, within that mainstream consensus lay a tapestry of quirks. Did you know some Victorian dentists endorsed wearing a small piece of lodestone under the tongue to deter cavities? The belief that a magnet could draw out invisible toothworms was, by today's standards, scientific folly. But it reveals something surprising. People then desperately sought agency over a malady that often felt inevitable. They bought lodestones from apothecaries, tucked them under silk scarves, and continued to floss, or its 19th century equivalent, between bouts of pain. That magnetic fascination was the quirk that chafed against emerging scientific rigor, demonstrating how folklore and empiricism coexisted, often uneasily. Now, look around your modern viewfinder. a sterile dental office, instruments sterilized in ultrasonic cleaners, fluorescent lights reflecting off polished tile. You sip mint-flavored mouthwash, not clove oil or carbolic acid. You schedule appointments via smartphone, not by sending a page to a secretive tooth puller. What was once a ritualized spectacle has become routine care, a visit as casual as a manicure for many. Even braces, those bizarre contraptions that once required tightening bits of silk and gold wires, have evolved into near-painless, barely noticeable aligners ordered online. Contrast that with Victorian patients who braved headgear that felt like strapping a harness to your skull, all while silently reciting their lessons about correct pronunciation to distract themselves from gnawing discomfort. Yet this legacy isn't linear. Historians still debate whether early anesthesia experiments, ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide, saved more patients than they endangered. Indeed, the accidental deaths from chloroform misdosage in the late 1850s sparked public outcry, yet spurred regulations that eventually refined dosage control. That tension between progress and peril lingers. Without those trials, modern anesthesia might be delayed by decades. But at what cost of trust? You, reclining here, grasp that every advance springs from tentative courage and collective trial and error, often muddled by hubris. The Victorian era also gifted us the concept of preventive dentistry, welcome advice on daily brushing, tongue care, and the importance of diet. Although toothbrushes then had stiff hog bristles and powdered pastes contained pulverized brick dust, the principle was clear. Maintain your mouth so you never face the John behind the counter tooth wizard's pliers. That debate, whether brushing thrice daily prevents decay, echoes shell. Some modern skeptics downplay fluoride's value. Others vocally resist fluoridation. Yet imagine life without that early push. Plaque, gum inflammation, and tooth loss would reclaim the forecast. Even now, in 2025, global health organizations cite that regular dental hygiene practices trace their lineage directly to these Victorian pamphlets, urging genteel women to scrub their teeth in front of mirrors. Consider the quirky fringes, too. Doctors who prescribed potato charms or recommended chewing licorice root to ward off toothworms. Those who painted toenails with tincture of iodine to numb neuralgia by redirecting pain. Today, you'd cringe at such absurdities, but they underscored desperation and hope. Two forces as potent in 2025 as they were in 1850. You hold that perspective, aware that even in your world of digital X-rays and precise laser ablation, patients still grasp at supplements, homeopathy, or wisdom videos to treat toothache relief. It is an unbroken human impulse to seek comfort beyond the clamps and drills. Your modern dentist, suiting up in nitrile gloves, tapping a high-tech scanner, actually stands on the shoulders of Victorian innovators. Without those early experiments in drilling speed, without the rudimentary anesthetic trials, without the brass instruments that, however crude, defined extraction mechanics, your ceramic crowns and guided implant surgeries would lack a foundation. Even the concept of dental journals, sharing case studies, arguing over new techniques, originated in those 19th century periodicals, printed on heavy rag paper, read by lamplight in surgeons' offices. Now, you scroll through peer-reviewed articles on tablets, but the impulse to share, debate, and refine derives from that era. At the same time, remember that dentistry, then as now, reflected social inequality. Wealthy Victorians flaunted ivory dentures, drilled with precision devices, while poor factory workers endured makeshift extractions in alleyway clinics. Today, you might live in a country with universal dental care. Elsewhere, children still lose teeth to untreated cavities. Those stubborn disparities, the clash between those who can afford preventive care and those who cannot, persist, albeit in new forms. Historians still argue whether the pioneering dental schools of London and New York unwittingly codified elitism by charging fees that locked out working-class practitioners. And yes, that quandary reverberates. You, lying back in your chair, appreciate how economics and policy shape smiles as much as science does. You feel the hum of that old drill in your bones, the faint vibration connecting you to someone who, in 1872, watched the surgeon wind a crank handle. You taste the memory of swishing salt water in a chipped porcelain basin, recalling a grandmother admonishing you to keep it clean after supper. You smell clove oil in the back of your mind, even though what's really floating in your nostrils is a sterile disinfectant. All converge to a singular revelation. Dentistry's past is alive inside you, blending eccentric practices and earnest innovations into the rest of your mortal coil. And so, you surrender to this descent towards slumber, secure in the knowledge that those immature toothworms of yesteryear have been routed, and that the twinges once wrenched by hand-cranked drills have evolved into tolerable hums of electric precision. Your molars, strong and white, occupy a lineage stretching through cobbled streets, antiseptic breakthroughs, and the steady claim that a brighter smile signifies a better world. You carry that legacy, 2 centuries of trial and triumph, each time you chew, each time you grin at a passing stranger, each time you sleep without the silent dread of a sudden ache. Now, dear listener, rest easy as the soft glow of candlelight dims to a gentle hush. Allow your breathing to slow, each exhale drifting away like smoke from a dying lamp. In this quiet, you know that every gentle twinge once endured has guided us here, to a place where pain is managed with ease, where a smile is a simple gift rather than a fearful gamble. Imagine your jaw resting softly on a pillow, free of anticipation, free of dread. Feel the years collapse into moments. The Victorian child clutching a clove oil swab, the intrepid surgeon winding a crank, the anxious patient in the waiting room grasping a teacup of comfort. All of them converge upon this very moment, where you lie cradled by blankets, your teeth at peace. Picture the clink of porcelain in a distant past, now replaced by hushed whispers of floss and fluoride. The world has changed, and yet the desire to care, for self and for others, remains constant. Your eyelids grow heavy, each pulse of thought softening into lullaby. The memory of drills and forceps lingers only as a distant echo, fading into warm quiet. Let each breath be a benediction, a small amulet against discomfort. In this silence, you understand that every whispered "open wide" and every cautious "don't move" lifted the shadow from soreness, paving a calm path for tomorrow. Now, breathe deeply one last time. Exhale. Allow your mind to drift beneath gentle waves, guided by the hum of progress that echoes from Victorian parlors to your modern bedroom. Close your eyes, dear listener, and rest. The world of gentle twinges has brought you here, to peace, to stillness, to dreams unbound.